Thanks very much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. And I'm delighted to be with you here tonight. I want to thank, first of all, our host, CIS, for hosting this wonderful conference, and all the conference organizers from Cornell, as well as the conference volunteers who I think shuttled us all from the airport here to the hotel today and made our lives a lot easier, at least my life a lot easier. I also want to recognize the excellent leadership of Sarah, Ronnie Kaufman, my colleague from the Gates Foundation, Kathy Kahn, and of course Jeannie Borlag-Lobby, in their support and vision for the WIT Award. It's been a true amazing experience to watch that blossom over the last 3 years and to see how many awardees have been present ever since. And congratulations to all of you who won tonight. I really look forward to touching base with you this week and hearing more about your careers and research. So it's worth noting that I was asked to give a very different kind of talk this week than the talks you'll likely hear for the next 3 days. And that's true both in terms of the content of my talk, but probably also the presentation as well. And some of you might thank me for that, and some of you might want me to apologize for that later on, and I'm happy to do either. Today I want to share a little bit about the Gates Foundation's viewpoint of technology adoption in our agricultural development strategy, and a bit more about the way that we think gender both constrains but also enables improved technology adoption in many of our investments. I want to make one caveat before I begin to say this, and that is that there's actually very little data out there on either social, cultural, or gender-based constraints of technology adoption in wheat production systems. I think this is because wheat's early success preceded, actually, the rise of social science discourse about the role of women in development and about the distribution of benefits of these production systems. And I raise that just to say that you'll hear very little about wheat in this presentation by evidence or by anecdote, but also to say there might be an opportunity now to actually look more deeply into wheat production systems and getting some more social science literature out and about. I want to say that there are some notable exclusions to that. That is, of course, people like John Dixon, Cheryl Doss at Yale, and even a young Cornell researcher, Katie Nelson, who's actually working on the roles and responsibilities of women in wheat production systems. Let me see. There we go. Thank you very much. So I like to give myself a bit of a narrative arc to these talks, and I hope that you'll bear with me. What we'll first be talking about is the Gates Foundation's view and reorientation of our ag strategy away from potential, i.e. stuffing the innovation pipeline, and much more orientated to impact. I'll talk a little bit about the troublesome and very complex arts of solving for technology adoption and the challenges that have been studied and identified that contribute to smallholders achieving technology adoption. And by adoption, I'm really just defining it as the sustained and persistent use of new technologies or services. Talk a bit about the role that culture has in muddying up a very complex system already. I'll give examples, both positive and negative, both from breeding, but also from tool development that show failures and successes in accommodating women and men's preferences into technology development, and later achieving adoption, or not, as the case may be. Talk about some of those solutions that have been put into place to achieve those technology adoption victories. And I'll end with a very kindly and empathetic call to action for each of you in the room. I've actually, just for personal reasons, plotted this out against tension and resolution. That's basically just to test my own storytelling abilities, or lack of abilities. So very quickly, first about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and our work in ag development. As a foundation, we're actually best known for our work in global health. But at the behest of our co-chairs, Bill and Melinda Gates, who began to see the link between health challenges around the world and food security in the developing world, and also the potential for agricultural innovation to move millions of poor out of poverty, we began investing deeply in agricultural development in 2007 and 2008. We, and by that I mean my colleagues and I, our program officers, we actually do very little. What we do is invest in all of you and find opportunities to support smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia to increase their productivity sustainably and move them and their families out of poverty. That's our ultimate goal. We are absolutely an innovation and technology-driven institution, but we recognize that increasing productivity and doing so sustainably is actually a multidisciplinary effort. And that's probably why I'm standing here today and not a weed ecologist. It will require more than just improved varieties, but also the enabling environment, human capital, and market demand to realize the potential of those technologies. So in that effort, we actually invest along the agricultural value chain everywhere from the molecule down to the mouth. Since 2008, we've invested approximately $3 billion in this space. We've hired a team of about 45 program officers, of which I am one. And very importantly, even before I was a twinkle in anyone's eye at the foundation had a very strong and empirically based conviction that if we intended to support smallholder farmers in the developing world and realize our goals of poverty reduction, we absolutely needed to be vigilant and responsive to the needs of both women and men smallholder farmers. And what convinced us about this goal was three things. One, the overwhelming dominance that women have in production systems of staple and livestock, crops that the poor actually depend on in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Two, recent demographic data that actually shows women's numbers increasing in production systems on farm as men move out into the urban and peri-urban areas. And three, that compared to their male counterparts on very comparable plots of land, women farmers are actually less productive, and we'll talk about why that's so in a minute. Meaning that if we could find strategies to increase women's underproductivity sustainably, we could be solving for an immediate inefficiency in the agricultural system. And this is so widely felt at the foundation that everyone from research assistants to Bill Gates himself recognizes this. So even when Bill talks about the work that we do out in public, he often refers to our core beneficiary as she or her. Now, in 2011, which some of you may have lived through with us, we actually decided to, quote, refresh our strategy or evolve it. And this was in the mind of increasing the foundation's impact per dollar in agriculture and ensuring that our strategy was on track to have the most impact possible. So we took a year off from grant making and grant management and actually looked at the work of others, looked at the investments that we had made since 2011 and since 2007, and taking input, sometimes very, very critical input, which is important, from partners, grantees, and farmers themselves. We refocused our strategy, moving away from some investments we had made in high-value export crops to focus exclusively on staple crops and livestock that the poor depend on. We also narrowed our geographic focus. We had previously been investing in a very diffuse portfolio across 24 countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And since the strategy refresh, we made that much more limited, investing in 9 countries very deeply in 3 states in India. And importantly, we reconceived our view of how change happens in the world and our role within it. And this is an incredibly esoteric, ridiculous slide that's internally driven, not meant for external consumption, but I'm showing it here just for a single reason. As you move your eye from the left hand of the slide to the right, you move from the assets the foundation has to invest, that is our grants, our voice, our own people. In interventions was together interact to generate our main outcome goal of our entire strategy, and that is to increase sustainable productivity growth with an emphasis on women smallholder farmers. Over time and with the right policy incentives, we believe that this growth will contribute to the transformation of the rural economy, disproportionately benefiting the poor and driving poverty reduction, and this is seen on the far right of the slide. But what I'm showing in this slide in particular occurs right in the middle of the slide, and that is the prerequisite for all other impacts to occur is actually the adoption of improved technologies and practices by smallholders themselves. And as a foundation, we had never explicitly called out adoption before this refresh strategy, but our renewed focus on impact and away from potential actually mandated that it be front and center. Low adoption rates of improved varieties, particularly staple crops, are well known throughout the developing world, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. We know rates of improved maize varieties are somewhere between 17 and 20% in sub-Saharan Africa, and we that's very dismal. We have grantees that report year after year 5 and 7% adoption rates of the varieties that we're investing in, but we know we need to do better. This is, of course, not just a varietal issue, but other innovations such as labor-saving devices remain stubbornly on the shelf in many, many countries. So we've really begun to dig into and invest in educating ourselves and our grantees on the adoption challenges. And in a recent grant that we co-funded with the DFID that we gave to MIT's Poverty Action Lab to evaluate the underlying or pre-existing constraints to smallholder adoption, they actually recently completed a very robust literature review of the vast body of literature that's out there about what happens to technology adoption in the developing world, particularly in agriculture. And I'll borrow heavily from that literature review for this slide. What MIT, of course, found was that the first thing, among all other things, is that for smallholder farmers to adopt a new technology, if they're willing to do it, it must first meet what we call a profitability condition. That is, the new technology must be perceived to improve yield or enhance overall profitability, but its real cost must be less than that overall total value. For instance, a new variety may increase yield, but it might be much more susceptible to drought, requiring a capital input of increased irrigation technologies. And the time and money required to build infrastructure for irrigation are what economists would call real costs. And if those real costs are higher than the perceived costs, that smallholder is probably not going to adopt that technology. And many of these other issues are well known to you, so even if a smallholder believes that a technology has met his or her profitability conditions, there are other inefficiencies that they have to consider. For instance, input and output market inefficiencies, the cost of accessing markets both to acquire and perhaps complementary inputs, or to sell surplus production from the success of a good technology, might be higher than the real or perceived benefits from the technology itself. Land market inefficiencies, where land access or tenure is insecure or risky, many farmers will not have the incentive to invest in a new technology, particularly if the corresponding capital improvements are required to achieve the technology's full potential. And here we can think again about the role of irrigation. There's also labor market inefficiencies. This is actually what really interests me at the foundation, where we're finding that grantees that are successful in increasing adoption of improved varieties, for instance, are actually seeing household labor costs go up. And we're prognosticating that those household labor costs are actually going to drive disadoption of improved varieties over time. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And finally, there's education and information asymmetries, where education is strongly correlated with a strong tendency to adopt new technologies and varieties. So these findings are actually driving some important changes of how we as a foundation actually think about supporting grantees and the types of grants that we actually support. And our hypothesis is that technologies and practices being developed are the ones that we are investing in actually need to be developed understanding and the needs and preferences of those we're trying to support, i.e. they have to be user designed. What this has meant for us is that we've actually gotten more serious about a couple of key areas, hoping to promote that hypothesis. One is that we've gotten serious again about funding programs deeply in specific geographies. Instead of finding a very broad set of investments, we're going quite deep to really understand individual contexts and geographies. Two, we've begun to actually articulate grant design in terms of how grants impact farmers. So our director of agricultural development, a guy named Sam Dryden, who some of you might know, literally goes around the foundation drawing these concentric circles, putting a woman farmer at the center and saying, how does your grant impact her? I want to know what it means to her. So when Kathy and I go up to defend a new grant opportunity to our supervisors now, we have to say what that grant means in relation to her life and how it's been designed meeting her needs and preferences. And finally, and also we've borrowed from what the design community has already made a fantastic living at doing, and what they've been doing for many, many years, designing things like shopping carts, telephones, and even public education systems. And that is, if you want your project to be used, you must design it with the end user in mind. So we're working with world-class design institutions who've designed everything that we could possibly think of under the sun to understand what they call human-centered design and how can we apply that to agriculture. And of course, we're always continuing to encourage grantees to embrace, where practical, both participatory breeding and participatory varietal selection, to try to get research and development out of the labs, out of research stations, and out onto the field so farmers can actually be influencing the types of varieties that they will hopefully one day be adopting. And in the end, what we're doing is we're insisting that we reorient our strategies and investment priorities away from potential and towards use and impact. The foundation is really committed to grantees to ensure this is getting done right. Oh, I cheated. Hold on. That was a punchline. Now, to many breeders and researchers and designers, even like myself, adoption is a demand problem. It's not our problem. It's a constraint on the farmers themselves as an inability for them to adopt something. But here I'm really deeply indebted to a woman named Dr. Catherine Arsaga, now of IFPRI and formerly of the World Bank, who actually put together a very nice framework drawing the two sides of the coin of adoption to suggest that the necessary pathway to increase adoption of beneficial, i.e. good technologies, is actually absolutely both a supply and a demand problem. That is, the interface between the two of supply and demand will actually go far to enable improved adoption. So on the left-hand side of this framework, we actually have all of us sitting in this room, those of us enabling improved technologies from pre-breeding all the way upstream and all the way downstream to the NARs themselves. On the right-hand side, we have farmers, people in the supply chain, and even consumers, or those people who are going to ultimately, hopefully, be using the technologies and innovations that we're investing in. The important thing about this frame is that the supply of innovations and the actors that use them are absolutely very much linked in what Catherine calls bridging institutions and processes. Those are, in fact, when a variety becomes locally adapted. Those are things like human-centered design, participatory varietal selection. And it's when the demand is influencing design and design is responding to demand and context when Catherine prognosticates that obviously adoption is much more likely to occur. And I'll refer back to the slide briefly. But not before I redo the punchline, which was just to simply pause on this and say, we should know by now that, of course, good design is a supply failure, as in this incredibly awful innovation. This innovation nicely captures a badly designed innovation, but a very industrious and well-resourced user who clearly has a need for this particular technology. That's a little inappropriate for gender talk, I apologize. So the foundation is increasingly interested in increasing impacts, and we have better understanding adoption challenges and opportunities. And like many of you, we know the factors that appear to both influence and enable, but also constrain adoption. But what's actually more interesting to us these days is actually to go beneath the surface a little bit of both preferences and behaviors to why people behave that they do, the way that they do, and why they make the choices that they make. In fact, what does culture and society say about our preferences and behaviors? Well, an awful lot, according to many anthropologists and ethnographers. This illustration is actually from a bunch of European anthropologists and ethnographers who make a fantastic living working for global companies designing products all over the world. And these companies hire them out to go do ethnographies upstream in product development to help influence the usability of these products. And just to give you an example, the companies have really found that both observable behaviors are as important as what drives consumers and users to behave that way. And sales are an excellent example of how they know that getting beneath the surface of behaviors and preferences actually works. And I'll give you just a quick example of a colleague of mine who actually is one of these European ethnographers who was hired out by a firm that was building public playgrounds. So she was hired to go study how children play, ages 5 to 12. So in the States, she went to a bunch of public playgrounds to observe the behaviors of boys and girls playing on these swing sets and jungle gyms and monkey bars. What she found was that actually boys aged 5 to 12 were dominating a particular set of these activities, when boys were swinging down back and forth on these monkey bars, and girls were very much waiting on the sidelines. And she assumed this was because boys at that age might have more bravado, want to get up higher than girls. They might also have greater upper body strength. But in fact, when she pulled the girls and boys aside and spoke to them separately later on in the day, what she found was that the girls actually really wanted to use the monkey bars. But in fact, they felt ashamed because they were wearing skirts most of the days after schools and didn't want to swing up high in case the boys would make fun of them or look up their skirt, something like this. So there's a lot of social capital that they assigned to using the monkey bars, and a lot of shame and embarrassment they felt was a cost to using it. So as a result of this insight, she actually went back to the company that was designing these kind of public playground systems and designed a much lower set of monkey bars that girls apparently are using all over the eastern seaboard of the United States. So it's interesting in speaking to these researchers, and I have been doing this for the past couple of years to try to get insights into agricultural development strategies, is how often gender, as in the example before, emerges as a statistically significant determinant of how individuals behave and prefer, and how often things like gender or social norms or culture dictate why people act the way that they do. And I'm sure that we could all think about different examples from our own lives about this. So in addition to the known constraints of technology adoption, the market-based ones, the economic ones, I think we must add social and gender-based constraints when we think about the whole innovation pipeline leading to adoption. So back to agriculture, the same appears to be true. The literature suggests that women farmers are less likely, and by some estimates as much as 30 to 40% across commodities in sub-Saharan Africa at least, to adopt new technologies in their male counterparts. That's an incredible gap. And it's this gender gap which not only has an impact on women's ability and willingness to adopt, but also on the returns themselves to those agricultural technologies. So when we take the known factors that both constrain and perhaps enable adoption, things like the education of the adopter, their access to credit, their access to other enabling inputs like fertilizer, and their access to other labor and mechanical equipment, women are actually at every turn disadvantaged compared to men. This is data from FAO just last year. And you'll see that's actually worldwide. And the FAO estimates, and the World Bank just confirmed this in a recent study, on the basis of these gaps between women and men and farmers accessing these different technologies and inputs, women are actually 20 to 30% less productive than men on comparable plots of land. So for me, this is incredibly frustrating. It's not about inequality. For me, it's about inefficiency. We keep improving varieties today to attain more yield, to feed a growing planet, all very important things to be doing, but we could actually recoup lost yields today if we simply implemented policies and better designed solutions for women that close this gap and do it now. So think back to our supply and demand framework of adoption, and what does that say about gender? Well, from the demand side, women, as we now know, are less likely to access the enablers of quote-unquote of adoption that have been identified, making them less likely to adopt. And as we'll hear more about in a second, preferences and what makes a technology beneficial can be individually determined and are often very distinctive by gender. But also importantly, from the supply side, i.e. our domain and our responsibility in this room, women's preferences are also less likely to be taken on board in priority setting in early stages of R&D processes. Women are actually rarely considered farmers, despite the numbers that Jeannie and myself just quoted, and their dominance in many of these production systems. It's important to know that often women themselves don't self-identify as farmers. The attention from researchers often goes directly to the heads of the household, who are presumed to have total decision-making control in the household, and we'll see in a moment that's not absolutely true. And there's some evidence that women actually do represent women's needs and interests better than men. So when we think about the diversity and distinction between women and men researchers, 1 in 5 agricultural researchers in sub-Saharan Africa is a woman, 1 in 3 in the US is. We can actually understand why there's a bit of a difference in terms of women's needs getting up and into the innovation pipeline. Now I'll add just one more complexity before I start making it a little bit easier. Many studies on gender are actually done at the household level by examining differences in male-headed households or in female-headed households, and that's kind of all that we get. But for adoption, we really need to think about what happens within the household and who makes decisions within the household. A recent survey that we just commissioned by TNS Research in Tanzania suggests that actually about 75% of ag decisions undertaken in smallholder households in Tanzania, i.e. what to buy, what to plant, how to distribute labor, are actually joint decisions taken between a man and a woman, i.e. women in male-headed households have considerable influence over adoption decisions. And we're going to pick on the rice community here for just a second, because it probably wouldn't be a week convening unless we did. The case of New Rice for Africa, Naraika is actually a great example to underscore this point. New Rice for Africa, Naraika was widely heralded as a boon for women-headed households in Western and Eastern Africa, who were widely seen as adopting that variety more quickly than male-headed households. But this was not universally held true over time. And later on, when analysis was conducted, researchers found that Naraika adoption actually greatly increased overall household labor. But particularly in the areas of weeding, Naraika was much more susceptible to weeds, and in pest control, it was highly attractive to birds. So both pests are exclusively the responsibilities of women in many of these countries where Naraika was being introduced. So about 2/3 of the new labor inputs required to realize the full potential of Naraika was actually borne by women in the household. And over time, actually those gains in yields were undermined by the increased time she had to spend on those additional labor costs, and she was actually pulling her children out of primary school to actually help her mitigate those extra time costs. So there was a negative impact on overall household welfare. And many women would ultimately influence the household to disadopt Naraika, and there's some evidence that shows the contribution to Naraika's disadoption over time came from this asymmetry of labor within the household. So let me give you an example of how a grantee of ours really first experienced the challenge of listening to individual preferences and designing a universally beneficial project, and frankly failed as a result. This is an anonymous grantee and an anonymous grain. It really is. This project is to develop a new variety with potential to boost yields and ensure food security in sub-Saharan Africa. What was important in the project was to develop a variety that, of course, is beneficial, i.e. high-yielding and resistant to stresses, but also that the consumers and farmers would want to adopt. So during varietal development, researchers in the project wanted feedback directly from the farmers. This was a great development. So they met with groups of farmers to talk about what they wanted in their most beneficial varietal. And they used a very nicely developed PBS process. And very often, that group of farmers that they met with ended up being predominantly men. And while they used PBS to a T, i.e. really asked about the traits that were being preferred, and were able to actually roll it into the design innovation process, it did not necessarily include women farmers' voices or preferences at all. And male farmers tended above all else to prioritize yields. While getting feedback, of course, is great, and we would certainly encourage that of this grantee and others, talking to male farmers only gave the researchers one side of a very important story. While they're equally active farmers, women and men have very different roles and responsibilities and tasks on farm. And because women's responsibilities tend to include things like land preparation, weeding, milling, cooking, for instance, in addition, I should say, to her household work, of which her husband generally doesn't participate in at all, it's well documented that women farmers prioritize other traits in addition to yield and the varieties that they themselves want to plant and produce. They overwhelmingly prioritize traits like pest resistance, cooking time, and taste, along with yield, especially those traits that might save her a little bit of time during the day. So we can imagine what happened when the seed was developed, taking only men's preferences into account. The seed produced great yields, absolutely, but produced more weeds, and the grain was hard to mill, and it took much, much, much longer to cook. And as with Naraika, each of these activities added on to a woman's workload and took away from her other household responsibilities. I should also say that Simit South Asia did some nice work on wheat using PBS in Nepal. many years ago, and they found very similar differences in trait preferences between women and men. On the left-hand side, you see that women were prioritizing things like disease resistance, pest resistance, and here we go, good chapati making qualities. While the men were prioritizing late heat bed tolerance and large white grains because they're the ones who are actually feeling the stacks of this particular wheat. And good chapati making ended up at the bottom of their trait priority list. And Sim in South Asia has this brilliant final line to this report that they produced that says, quote, divergence of preferences may highlight the need to develop varieties based on how they are, quote, used in the household, if we are to satisfy both of our customers. So I'll just give you one more example. It's not a varietal example, but actually is a positive example of what can happen when you innovate and put good design processes to use. This organization actually designs and manufactures treadle pumps, and I think many of you know these are low-cost, water-efficient manual pumps designed for poor farmers to irrigate about an acre or less. And they work what Americans would call a little bit like a Stairmaster, kind of an American piece of exercise equipment, if you know what I mean. These pumps are marketed up and down Eastern Africa, where there's a growing market for them, so women frankly don't have to spend hours a day doing inefficient bucket irrigation or hand irrigation. But interestingly for this particular organization, in some regions, in some very specific regions, for instance in the north of Tanzania, the Tanga border, just right underneath the Kenya border, they found that actually 0 pumps were being sold to women buyers, and they were meticulously keeping track of who was buying their treadle pumps. And there are other pockets as well where there actually was no sales going to women, and this is actually very different than what they were seeing in Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. So they did some research and actually found a really interesting and unforeseen obstacle to treadle pump sales in these regions. What they found was in these regions it's culturally unacceptable for a woman to ride a bicycle. The motion reveals too much of her thigh, and these are very conservative communities. So the locals told the salespeople that working the treadle pump actually mimicked the motion of riding a bicycle too much. And in these communities, women refused to use it. They would lose too much social capital in their communities were they to get on a bike or on a treadle pump. So with the information in hand, the treadle pump manufacturer went out to meet with women to actually co-design a solution of something that women would actually want to use. And the result has been a huge success. This is the new hip pump, which has this ingenious design of a simple pivot hinge that women can actually lean their hip against a little bit like this, which makes it much easier to use and much more culturally acceptable to use for women in these particular regions. And 3 years later, the organization acknowledges that sales have gone up on the hip pump for women in these regions. Women are reporting higher yields and more income in their pockets. So the complexities of adoption are pretty daunting, as we've just heard. And you add in gender and the incredible differences in culture, I mean, in those little pockets of northern Tanzania, who would know, that influence adoption decisions, and these can all seem very insurmountable for an organization working upstream. But in fact, solutions are already at work, and we're already seeing positive benefits and increased impact. Methods, for instance, that link farmers early in the innovation process are occurring with greater frequency, which the foundation absolutely applauds. We know this is occurring, for instance, with Yeshi in Ethiopia using farm family trials under the DRW project, which is wonderful. We know that staff are getting trained in participatory methods, so staff can figure out how to hear farmer preferences and needs all along that innovation pathway towards adoption. And the grantees are conducting analyses of the different roles, responsibilities, needs, and preferences of women and men both along the commodity chain. This will help inform them when farmers need to give input. I also say that there are kind of great efforts out there right now to better ensure that women are represented and influencing the highest levels of R&D and priority setting, and I'll name just 2 here. The first is Award, African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, which is actually one of my favorite grantees of the foundation, some of you might have heard of. This actually is a program run by the CG and sponsored by both the foundation and USAID. It's to build the careers of senior women agricultural scientists in Africa. It's a 2-year fellowship, and they have assigned research attachments It's a tremendously important and beneficial project, and I know that Ruth Manera from CARI is here this week, and she's an award fellow. Oh, I hope a proud one, and I hope to meet her later on this week to talk about her experience as an award fellow. And of course, there's the AWIT awardees that we just heard from today. And this is to say, with the leadership of Cornell, that we've really seen an increase in thinking about women in wheat production, wheat research. And importantly, we don't want to put all of the responsibility on speaking for the world's women on these women's shoulders. And of course, Francis makes that an excellent point when he won the Mentorship Award. But certainly, efforts like this are a good start to try to change the paradigm to get women's preferences much more upstream. And finally, I would just say that as a foundation, we've actually established expectations for grantees and what we expect out of them when we make an investment in an organization. We actually ask that your grant be designed in what we call a gender-responsive manner. That is, we ask that you conduct analytical research prior to your program design to get to the bottom of any cultural, social, or gender-based implication that might impede or constrain your innovation pathway towards adoption. We call this, by the way, knowing her. We ask that design measures are considered to reach and benefit both women and men, and we consider this to be designing for her as well as for him. And finally, we ask that grantees monitor their progress and impact vis-a-vis women and men they're intending to serve and benefit. And this includes women in male-headed households. We actually ask for you to collect data inside the household as well as at the household head level. Our impetus in asking this of all of you is not to impose a heavy burden or to insist on you each to solve gender inequality over the world. That's not what this is about. This is actually about smart design. It's about greater impact. It's about getting your products to be more user-friendly and increasing the likelihood of them being adopted over time. It's about anticipating challenges. And finally, it's about maximizing the efficiency gains that can occur when women, as well as men farmers in the developing world, have the tools that they need to feed their families and move out of poverty. And with that, I'll sit down and be quiet. But I'm happy to take some questions